Welcome to our fourth week of this Advent study, our study on Advent through the lens of race. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and we'll begin with lighting the Advent candles. Let's see. Okay, is that, oh, I forgot it does this weird thing with my screen here. No, that's not working. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so this, our fourth week, we're looking at the theme of love. So if you should have a candle with you, like you've had previous weeks, something to write on, something to write with. I'm in my office, so on campus, so I don't have a live candle. I have my electric candle, but nonetheless a candle. So go ahead and grab your candles and we can read together the poem by Howard Thurman, I Will Light Candles This Christmas, as we light our candles. So feel free to read with me even though you're muted. I will light candles this Christmas, candles of joy despite all sadness, candles of hope where despair keeps watch, candles of courage for fears ever present, candles of peace for tempest-tossed days, candles of grace to ease heavy burdens, candles of love to inspire all my living, candles that will burn all the year long. So this week, we're really focused on that second to last line, candles of love to inspire all my living. And we'll be going through the lectionary passages as we have done, a brief reflection on a Christmas meditation by Howard Thurman from The Mood of Christmas, and then a racial healing practice at the end of our time together. So our lectionary passages this week are 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 through 11, verse 16. Then there are two that are alternates. There's Luke 1, 46b through 55, that's Mary's Magnificat. And the alternative to that is Psalm 89, verses 1 through 4 and 19 through 26. Then we have Romans 16, 25 through 27, and Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. So we have these two Luke passages that are giving the narrative of Mary's learning of what's about to take place, the Annunciation, and then her Magnificat in the other Luke passage there. I want to turn our attention though to 2 Samuel first. So in 2 Samuel verses 7, 11, 1 through 11 and 16, David is really wanting to build a house for God. So he's talking to the prophet Nathan, his spiritual advisor, and David notes the irony of his success and his settled comfort in a house of cedar, while he says the ark of God stays in a tent. So at first, Nathan thinks this is a good idea, but then in a dream, God reveals to Nathan that it's not. And so I'll pull up that passage for us and I'll read it aloud. You can read it on the screen as well. So in this dream, God is revealing to Nathan that he should tell David this isn't really such a good plan. So the scripture reads, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, Did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep to be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. And evildoers shall inflict them no more, as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So as we're thinking about the theme of love this week, I really want us to begin to start to think of how we show love and care. And it seems here that in these passages, David wanted to build this house for God, that it was something he wanted to do to honor God. But this passage really reminds us that God doesn't live up there, right, in heaven, or even in our beautiful church building on Renewal Way, that God really resides in our life together. And I found this a really poignant message this week, as we're thinking of the holidays coming up, and some of us, like me, aren't going to be with our families in the way that we want to. But thinking that God isn't limited to a single place, but that God is in our life together. And I think this is an important point that we'll come to when we talk about racial reconciliation and racial healing. But as it relates more broadly to justice, back up here. It's clear that God's response to David's building project is really a very theologically and socially loaded response. So it's not that God is saying, don't build me a house or a temple or a church because I don't feel like it, right? There's a reasoning behind it. God's presence with the people along their journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom has been portable and movable, right? So their God, the God of the people of Israel, unlike other deities, does not live in a building or a heavenly palace, but he lives among the people in the midst of all the complexities of the people's life together, which is to say in their economic, in their political, and even their social relationships. So, while David wants to build a home for God, God already has a place. So God is saying, I don't need you to make me a house. In fact, I'm going to make a house for you, a place for your people to rest. David is possibly very well motivated and intentioned in wanting to build this place for God, but God doesn't seem to want this particular kind of offering from him. Instead, God wants to provide for the collective well-being of the people. So we see this shift that God is refocusing back on the people and what God can do for them. So in the Psalm, that's one of the optional readings for this, we have more of God's promise and the people's response, words that have remained with us long after David's reign is ended and all after his people are scattered around the world. So in Psalm 89, and I'll just read verses 1-4 here. It reads, I will sing of your steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth, I will proclaim your faithfulness to all generations. I declare that your steadfast love is established forever. Your faithfulness is as firm as the heavens. You said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to my servant David, I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. So here we have again this idea that that God is providing for these future generations. And in Mary's song, we see really similar themes as in this psalm. So it's in many ways similar. And if you're paying attention, yes, this was also an alternate reading for last week too. So it shows up in the lectionary twice, Mary's song here. Last week as an alternate reading, and then this week as an alternate reading. So in this, Mary is singing God's praises, not only for how God is blessing her, but for how he has blessed the people of Israel. But remember, this isn't Israel's moment of triumph in which she's proclaiming this. It's at the time of their subjection to the Roman Empire. It's at a time when she's overcoming her fear of this pregnancy. And yet she sings this song of liberation and God's steadfast love. So here we see love in these passages too, love and compassion. She's saying, my soul magnifies the Lord and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he's looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me, and holy is his name. So she goes on to talk about how God's mercy goes on from generation to generation, how God lifts up the lowly, how he fills the hungry with good things, how he's remembered Israel and extended this covenant promise from the time of Abraham forward. So the gospel passage really causes us to look at Mary too, in the moment that we call the Annunciation. It's depicted in so many artworks because it's this moment of an angel meeting this ordinary young woman who has found favor with God. I picked the image here on the screen from Henry Tanner, who's a well-known African-American artist from, this one was painted in 1898. And I love this image because Mary really looks contemplative, right? She's pondering this as she's seeing this angel who we don't see with elaborate wings as we might in like Fra Angelico's Annunciation image. But here it's this ray of light. And if you look at the light, you can see that there's a shelf behind it that causes this cross, this horizontal line that meets the vertical light. And you see kind of a cross shape there. In many artworks of the Annunciation, you have these references either back to the Garden of Eden, where you see the expulsion of Adam and Eve, but also the need for the coming incarnate God. And here you see a foreshadowing of what's to come, right? So you see Mary receiving this news of her soon-to-be pregnancy, but then also foreshadowing what comes even beyond that to Christ's death and ultimate resurrection and glory. So in this moment, it really is about this ordinary young woman who's found favor with God. Gabriel, the angel, gives her this terrifying news that she's going to bear the Son of God, the Son of the Most High, even though she's not even married to Joseph yet. And so I want to read a little bit from the the Preaching God's Transforming Justice, where it speaks of how Mary serves as a reminder of what's possible during this fourth week of Advent. This is by John Buchanan, who's writing this. He says, Mary reminds us that God cares deeply about the human condition. God chose a modest, nondescript young woman. God chooses to be with the modest and marginal, the poor and weak, the humble and forgotten. Mary reminds us that God can use modest men and women who do not seem to have much to commend them, not much that the world recognizes as important and powerful. Sometimes young human beings do the most important work. Mary reminds us that we should expect God to show up, not only in inspired worship, beautiful art, and elegant theology, but where the poor people are forgotten, vulnerable people oppressed, weak people overlooked. Mary is part of a movement that is more than a political agenda advocating for human rights, equal justice, and the excruciatingly difficult work of peacemaking. So he's saying she's more than that. She's more than this movement. Mary is a reminder of the most distinctive characteristic of biblical faith, namely the profound compassion of God. Many Christians picture God as all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. Our God can be a little intimidating, actually, but for centuries, Mary has reminded the faithful that God is also infinite compassion and infinite love. So for centuries, Mary has reminded people whose needs were urgent and who needed something more than a well-reasoned theology. She's reminded us of the accessible side of God. So this week, as we're really thinking of what it means to think of love and how love relates to our work for racial healing, I think we ought to begin with what these passages show us about love, what these lectionary passages reveal. And the first thing I think that they show us is that God shows abiding, steadfast love and compassion for us. So we see that in the gospel, we see that in the Psalm, we see that in the Magnificat, we see that in Romans, we see that in the 2 Samuel passage, that God is the source of love. And the source not just of any kind of love, but an abiding, steadfast love, and that God has compassion on us. So when we're acting out of compassion for others, we're tapping into this source of love that God is flowing into us. I think these passages also call us to respond to God's love that is expressed in a human life and in the drama of a human life. So I think it's really notable that Mary reminds us that our faith is a response to a love that wasn't expressed as a carefully reasoned treatise, right? So Mary isn't giving us a theology textbook. Mary is giving us a human life, the incarnate God in God's fullness, in the form of a child, in the form of a human life. And so this love, this compassion is really played out in the everyday drama and passion of betrothal and marriage and pregnancy and birth, and then ultimately in death. Right? So it's a call to remind us to respond to God's love in human lives. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about theological texts and all of that. But I think this is an important reminder that when it comes down to it, that what God gave us, the most important theological, event, so to speak, is this person, is this child. So a call to pay attention to human life. These lections also encourage us to look for God where people are hurting, where people are oppressed, where people are overlooked, and to care for the well-being of our collective life. So again, going back to that 2 Samuel passage, David wants to build this house for God, but God wants to care for the people. And we see that over and over in these scriptures, right? So following God, we too are looking to care for the well-being of our collective life. And as Mary's song lifts up, we're looking for those who are hurting, who are oppressed, who are overlooked. Mary herself inspires us to be modest and ordinary people who do important work. And, you know, I think that's a good reminder for all of us who don't have positions where we're really in the public eye very much, to know that the work we do might still be important. And then finally, I think what these passages give us is a call to an expansive vision of community. So a lot of the passages for today really focus on God's steadfast love demonstrated to David and to his people. So we might be tempted to think of like God's chosen ones with all this language of David and Abraham and the generations to follow. But in Romans chapter 16, verses 25 through 27, Paul is speaking of God's covenant now being made known to all the Gentiles. So it's through the testimony of the prophets that all people are now included. In Christ, God's steadfast love comes to all, which, you know, is one of the most beautiful things about the Christian gospel, I think, right? That it's for all of us. So that last point of these passages really calling us to an expansive vision of community really leads us into our racial healing practice, which is engaging in collective healing. Pause this for a moment, or stop this for a moment. When we're talking about healing, we're really talking about something that is not just individual. A lot of what we've been discussing these past few weeks, the first 3 weeks of Advent and the racial healing practices we've gone over, have related to individual healing practices or those that you might share with close friends or family members. But today, I'm encouraging us to think bigger, right? To think in a more expansive way about collective healing. So what we're discussing today is about racial healing in collective settings. So I've been using a lot of resources from the Racial Healing Handbook. And the author of that, Elise Edwards, describes what a racial justice community is. So let me read her words. She says, a racial justice community is a group of people working together on racial healing and accountability endeavors. Developing and being a part of a racial justice community is key to being able to continue the work that you've begun. So the work that we've begun in this study, the work really that we started last summer and continued through this study and into our life beyond, is really community based. So part of it we can do by ourselves, but if we're going to make social change, this is work we have to do together. So Dayspring could be a racial justice community. That is a group of people working together on racial healing and accountability. You also, as individuals, might find another community that you're a part of that does this collective work. The key thing is that the group you find needs to be committed to growth, to healing, to action, and to accountability, right? So you want growth that is, constantly calling you to a higher self, to these purposes of God, healing, right? So that you can have that transformation that's so needed, so that you can see that transformation in the world around you, but starting from within yourself. Action, because of course we're not just sitting there contemplating these things, but we're doing something about it. And accountability, because we know when we engage in the work of justice or any serious work that we're about, we know it helps to have people who keep us committed to that, but also people who help us find our way back when we've gone the wrong way. So I think Dayspring could really be this kind of community. And I think in many ways it is already, as we've seen through a study like this. So in a minute, I'm going to read a Christmas meditation from Howard Thurman, or read a little bit from it. But I wanted to see if there are any questions that you have that I can answer. I know I've been talking for a little bit. And when I do the screen share, I can't see your faces. I can only see like 3 of you. Any questions I can answer, or any comments on the lectionary passages and the commitment to community and collective healing? Okay, now I could see some of you taking notes, which is always great, right? Because I teach in a classroom, and I love it when people are writing as I'm talking. It makes me feel like something's happening there. You will need to take some notes in a few minutes, but not yet. So I don't have a separate handout for you this week because we're just doing it on paper. So if there aren't any questions, I'll go to the Howard Thurman reading. Now this is from, we've been taking a lot of these from the Mood of Christmas, this collection of writings. Early on in the book, he describes how Christmas, how there's this mood of Christmas, right? So you may have noticed a lot of the readings that we've had from this book aren't really speaking specifically about Christmas, but they're tying into the themes, the feel of Advent and of Christmas. So if you have the book, we're on page 87. There's a Christmas meditation here called No Man is an Island. And let's see, I'll share my screen again. And so if you don't have the book, you can follow along. So in this, Thurman begins with the words of John Donne, no man is an island, and begins describing how these words call us to social responsibility. So Thurman writes, "It is of crucial importance for each person to consider how he relates himself to the society which of necessity he is a part. There is no alternative to the insistence that we cannot escape from personal responsibility for the social order in which we live. We are a part of the society in which we function. There can be no help for us if we lose our sense of personal responsibility for the social order. This means that there must be participation in the social process, and that quite specifically. Such participation means the wise and critical use of the ballot, the registering of our intent to share responsibility in government." So I want to point out here that a couple months ago in our study on the color of compromise, we talked about how many Christians have a theology that separates their religion from political life. And so here I'm calling your attention to Howard Thurman really saying, no, those things have to be knitted together. He's talking about things like voting as a part of our social responsibility. And of course, this is in the context of trying to expand voting rights for African Americans, for others who had been disenfranchised, right? So he's saying that this is really part of what it means to be a part of a society, right? To have social responsibility, you do certain things like vote, right? That's the registering of our intent to share responsibility in government. He goes on to say the moral inference is that there must not be a condemnation of the political process of society if we have been unwilling to stand up and be counted on behalf of the kind of government in which we believe and for which we are willing to work and sacrifice. So here he's saying that if we're not voting, we don't really have the moral high ground to complain, because we're not participating in the process that commits us to that. And then the last line on the screen here, he concludes this paragraph by saying, where social change seems to be urgent, we must share in that process as responsible, law-abiding citizens. He continues and says the ethical values by which we live must be implemented on the level of social change. This calls ever for a careful evaluation of the means to which we give our support. The means, of course, here he's talking about the ways in which we show our support for the causes we want. The means which we are willing to use must not be in real conflict with the ends which our values inspire. Practically, this means that if we believe in democracy, for instance, we must not be a party to means that make use of bigotry, prejudice, and hate. We must search and find the facts that are needed for judgment and cast our lot on the side of the issues which we are willing to embrace as our private and personal ends. In working on behalf of such ends, which are morally right as we see the right, we shall not cooperate with or be a party to means that seem to us evil, means that we would not use in our personal, private life. So the point here is that he's talking about this resonance between our personal lives, our private lives, and our public or collective lives. And he's saying the ways that we go about social change have to be consistent with those values that we hold most dear. Martin Luther King was really inspired by Howard Thurman's work, and particularly his work in Jesus and the Disinherited. But I think we see this principle really lived out in the nonviolent action that King was known for, and that others in the civil rights movement who were committed to nonviolence were pursuing. They were committed to living out a kind of way of doing change that was consistent with their highest values. So they weren't going to pursue an end of justice through any kind of means, that is, any kind of way that was unjust or that was doing harm to others. So it's a way of saying we're going to pursue the justice we want by committing to that kind of justice, right? So the means is the end, right? The end is the means. The way you get there is important. It's not just that you get to some ultimate destination of justice. You can't do that through unjust means, right? The only way to justice is to do justice, right? So that's really what Thurman was calling us to here, and really what we see in the life of Martin Luther King. So let's take a look at the means of collective racial healing that we can do together as a church and as other racial justice communities. And let's see if we can find a resonance between the personal/individual and the public or the collective. So here I'm going to go back to, here's where you want that piece of paper to take some notes, because we're going to have some discussion And I can't put everything all on the screen at once. If I were in a classroom and had a big old whiteboard, we could do this, but the little screen here, there's only so much we can put up at one time. So in this racial justice handbook that I've been using, the author draws upon the work of George Lakey, who talks about distinct roles that people can play in social justice change within justice movements. So I'll go through these 4 and then give you some examples, and then we'll come up with more examples, particularly examples that might relate to what we can do as a church. So the first role is the role of helper. So helpers provide services and skills that are designed to educate everyone, right? So they're about educating about what racism is and the harms of racism. And helpers also help, right, underprivileged people to have increased decision-making power. That's decision-making power over their lives and decision-making power based on their understanding of the systemic oppressions that are influencing their lives. Now, all of our lives are influenced by these systemic oppressions. Some of us are advantaged by them, some of us are disadvantaged by them. And the helper here is going to help us see what's taking place, right? What's happening, and then give us sort of a boost so that we can address some of these things. But it's the advocate who's doing a little more in terms of pushing the change itself. The advocate engages in legal methods of social change. So here we might think of enacting legislative policy, starting legal challenges to unjust laws and to the unjust treatment of individuals and communities. And the advocate also builds coalitions to work toward explicitly stated demands for justice. And then finally, the advocate assesses their progress, right? So they're assessing how the justice demands come to fruition or how they get stalled, right? So the advocate is trying to make this, trying to push a particular agenda, usually through the legal system. But there are other ways we might think of advocacy as well. But part of that work is noticing what works and what doesn't, right? So there's this assessment that advocates are doing. The organizer role, and here we might think of something like a community organizer, right? The organizer strategically focuses on long-term demands for justice and uses grassroots strategies, leadership development, consensus building, and coalition building to develop specific routes towards justice. So there's some overlap here between the advocate and the organizer. But here the organizer is really focused on helping us organize, right? Building those coalitions, building the leadership capacity, really building the movement itself, right? So that we can move forward. And then of course there's the rebel, right? We've talked about the term co-conspirator, right? You always have this term that indicates pushing the boundaries, right? Pushing the levels of acceptability. The rebel is the one who uses protest and street activism as vehicles for social justice change. The rebel uses specific measures of nonviolence. Again, we're talking about that. Nonviolent means being consistent with the aims with the ends we're pursuing. So the rebel uses specific measures of nonviolence to challenge people with power and to challenge unjust institutions. The rebel also focuses on strategically addressing specific issues and injustices in a public manner with a plan for success. So you can think of the rebel as the person out in the streets, but we don't have to really think of this as only the literal streets, right? This is the person out in public provoking people to make change. So you have your notes on this because I'm going to move to a slide where we have some examples. So you've written down what these four are. Wave me down if you need a few more minutes. Okay, so I'm going to move on to give you some examples so we can help let this sink in a little more. So the helper, again, is about providing services and skills. With the services, we're thinking about the services that help those without privilege to have increased decision-making power over their lives. So it's about really providing help, right? The helper role. So here we might think about education about racism and systemic oppression. So some of the things we've been doing in our church over the summer and in this series, I think is a helping role, right? We're trying to equip people to really wrap their mind around what this issue even is in the first place, right? So it's education about racism and systemic oppression. In the book, The Color of Compromise, Jamar Tisby talked about freedom schools as a kind of education about racism, but also education on the ways we might begin to overcome that. Helpers also provide services for those in need. So here we might think of providing services like money, right? Like building space, right? Places for people to gather, support for economic support, financial support for initiatives that are going forward. Just straight up manpower, or whatever the gender neutral term for that is, right? People power, there we go. You know, when you have a voter registration drive, having people out there who are trained as those who can enroll people to vote, right? So it's about looking at what resources you have, and then as people of privilege, right? Looking at the resources we have, and then seeing how we can help those who are not as privileged equip themselves, right? Again, not doing for them, but how can we help them to be in a position where they can do that work. In The Color of Compromise, Jamar Tisby also talked about reparations and said this is the second scariest R word, racism, right? So people are really afraid to talk about reparations, that this causes all kinds of angst and social pressure. But here, reparations, examples he gives of what this might look like are funding nonprofit initiatives led by Black people, funding Black-led church plants and religious organizations, developing scholarships for Black students to attend Christian plants and religious organizations, developing scholarships for Black students to attend Christian plants. Getting feedback on someone here, so make sure everyone's muted. And then we also have, under reparations, he also discusses investing in public schools. So even things like helping to provide equipment or technology to students in public schools who don't have the same types of things to help them succeed in schools, right? So that's the helper role, right? I think here, another thing I might add to the helper role is when we're talking about education, is education for white Christians, is learning theology from the Black church, from Indigenous Christians, from other non-white Christians. A couple years ago on campus, we had, as our McGee lectures, Willie Jennings, and he was talking from his book, The Christian Imagination. but he was saying how it would be really fascinating if we actually looked at the practices of people who did not create a Christianity in this dominating sense, right? But look at the different versions of Christianity we see around the world, that we see in the Black church, that really are about liberation from dominating systems. So part of helping here, I think, is the education. So let me open this up to you. Are there other things you can think of that might be ways churches can provide services and skills designed to help those without privilege have increased decision-making power over their lives, and to help everyone understand systemic oppressions? And you can unmute yourself and chime in. Any other things we want to add to this list of what helpers might do?
One thing that I have kind of thought of or seen in a few different church models is whenever churches are using like social enterprise as like a means of ministry, but then specifically thinking of like like empowering like kind of like microloans or something of like Black owned businesses and things like that.
I'm writing this down. Yeah, so microloans and other social enterprise models.
And like a social enterprise where that's like creating jobs in a community for people who already exist in that community. And so then giving them a means and then like a business that's able to then give job training to other people and create more jobs.
Great. Thank you, Bailey. Anyone else think of other things churches do or can do in this helping model? Okay, so let's move on to the advocate role then. So the advocate, again, is engaging in legal methods of social change, right? They're coalition building, they're assessing how justice demands come to fruition or get stalled. The most obvious form of advocacy is, the advocacy we think about related to pushing certain policies through, right? So this can be done at the local school district level, at the city council level, at the state legislature, in the US Congress. It can be in denominational organizations. It can even be online, right? Hashtag activism gets a bad rep, but when we think of something like the Me Too movement, or even Black Lives Matter, right? The way that these hashtags have caught people's attention and made it impossible to ignore the issue is a kind of advocacy, right? So, I mean, can you think of particular types of things that that either as churches or as other racial justice communities we might want to advocate for? And again, not all of this has to be at the state level, right? Or in the secular realm. This can be work that needs to be done within our own denominations as well, and in our denominational bodies. So if you're afraid like, it gets messy, church getting into politics, think about our own Christian institutions and how we might advocate in those as well. What might be some of the things we advocate for?
Elise, it's Amy.
Go ahead, Amy.
I was struck by something you said. A phrase in the Thurman's reflection was the personal responsibility towards the social order. And typically when personal responsibility is talked about in the social welfare world, it's related to the TANF bill in the 90s, the Temporary Assistance Nutrition Bill. And personal responsibility meant we help those who help themselves, basically the working poor will help the working poor.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how the church can help frame the way that we talk about our personal responsibility for the social order
Yeah.
as Christ followers. Kind of flip the script on that. That phrase just stuck out to me because when I hear that, it's actually individual responsibility to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Talk about it in our public sphere.
Yeah. And what Thurman is calling us to is individual responsibility to take care of each other, right? And not just those who are able to take care of themselves, right?
Yeah, as a church, how can we frame the conversation like that towards that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think a lot of that ties into what we'll be talking about with the organizer role of ways that churches can help reframe certain narratives that are out there. But I think that also overlaps with the helper role of the idea of education, right? So a lot of what we do in church is Christian education or discipleship, right? Helping us learn how to see things in a way that that reflects the life of Christ and the work of salvation that Christ brings about in us, right? And so it's part of what we're needing to be trained in as Christians is to see care and love in terms that are not based on merit, right? On deserving. That's something specifically that the Christian narrative challenges us to not link mercy and grace and love with earning it, right? Or proving that we deserve it. Anyone else? Can you think of types of advocacy we might do around racial justice?
Elise, can y'all hear me? I'm on my phone.
I can hear you.
Okay. I have really been wondering what it might look like for denominations collectively to lead the way in advocating for reparations, and that can be that can happen in so many different ways. But to see, like, from, I read an article from the New York Times last week about some denominations that are beginning to talk about that and to push for that on a public policy level, but also in just how their denominations work in helping pairing up, churches that have money with churches that don't, and paying pastor salaries and scholarships and all sorts of things like that. I mean, reparations can mean so many different things, but I really am curious to see what it might look like if Methodists and Baptists and they all began advocating for that on local levels and national levels.
Yeah, I think that would be really exciting. I mean, we have in Color of Compromise book, those of you that still have your book, I encourage you to go back to the chapter on the fierce urgency of now, I think it's called, where it discusses reparations and the different action steps we can take as churches. And many of the things Tiffany just mentioned here, helping supplement salaries of pastors who are bivocational in Black churches, who are not able to give their full time to the ministry because they're working other places. I know several of these pastors, right? They have these other jobs, and then they're also trying to serve their church. And we know ministry, takes more than 15 hours a week, right? So they're helping them be able to commit their full-time work to ministry. Scholarships for students, finding ways to provide spaces for Black churches to meet, for small churches that we might think of as storefront churches, right? Giving them space to use. That these are ways that specifically begin to counteract the legacy that we have as American Christians of shutting down Black churches, right? That we begin to actually put efforts into building churches up, right? And that's why it's a form of reparation, right? But we can see it's you know, as Tiffany said, that you can see a real denominational push here. And I really loved what you said about denominations really leading the way on this, of showing what's possible. I mean, how refreshing would it be if our Christian organizations were known for doing something really, you know, novel and moving justice forward? You know, that would be pretty amazing, I think. So let me move on to this third one, the organizer role. The organizer, again, is about strategic focusing on long-term demands for justice. This organizer is really working on grassroots strategies, leadership development, consensus building, coalition building. Like the advocate, they're working on specific routes towards justice, but they're making sure we have the skills to bring people together to make it a movement and hold the movement together, right? So the organizer role here is, I think, relationship building. In churches that are predominantly white, like Dayspring, relationship building with churches that are not predominantly white would be a good first step here in organizing, right? In building coalitions. Training in deliberation, that is ways of talking about difficult issues, social issues, not just about race, but other social issues that tend to map on to different racial forms of injustice, and leadership development as part of training as well, right? Churches are really good at forming accountability groups. And so we can think about what this would look like in terms of racial justice, how churches might begin to make that part of the practice. Churches, some churches are known for relationship building between law enforcement and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. In the Black Lives Matter movement, we see sometimes this response that tries to position Black Lives Matter against all police, right? You know, Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter. When really what we're wanting to see from a justice perspective is equal treatment under the law, and to have ways that police officers can be treated with respect, but that they also show respect for the communities in which they do policing, right? So I think the church as mediator, we discussed a couple months back as one role the church might take. If we think of the church as a mediator, we can see the church becoming a group that brings disparate groups together, like actually, you know, creating those conversations. So that might be something that churches do. Can we think of other things that Dayspring might do, or that other churches might do in this consensus building, coalition building vein in this type of model?
I'm not sure if this would fall under the organizer or the helper more so, but I found this summer this account, and it was started by a mom who just wanted to like get more diverse literature in her kids' libraries. And then she made just a wish list on Amazon. And then like somebody shared it, and she like have like 15,000 or 1,500 followers the next day, and then like all these other moms are making these wish lists for their kids, of kids of color, but also kids with like disabilities, and just being able to represent yourself or see yourself represented in a story. So I don't know if something like providing diverse literature for schools would be like organizer in terms of like building that relationship with schools, or if that's more helper education.
I think that's helper and advocacy and organizing. I think that's all three so far, right? So helping in the sense of actually like providing books, right? And providing reading materials. And you can think of books and films and others, educational materials, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then advocacy, right? In pushing for a more well-rounded curriculum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And pushing for better stories being told.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is something people can certainly do in their own homes, right?
Yeah.
Make sure the stuff you're reading and the stuff your kids are reading is
Mm-hmm.
representative of a broad group of people. But when we begin to think about actual curriculum design, right, it can be advocacy. And then organizing, right? So when you begin to create the platforms and the means for sharing and distributing these lists, and for allowing that movement to grow, that's really the organizer role. So yeah, I think it's all three, depending on what particular role the church is taking there. That's a great one, Bailey. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else, something we might think of in the organizer role?
I think it might be interesting, like kind of what we're doing right now in a certain way, but thinking in terms of the formative church practices that we can organize around as congregations. And if we can build in, I don't know, Lent practices or things like this that actually form us in the direction of justice, but kind of building that into the fabric of how we form ourselves as Christians. So.
Yeah. So thinking of spiritual formation, really in terms of going back to some of what Amy was saying before, right? Of helping churches to give us a new narrative, right? Churches helping us to have a new narrative about some of these things. Yeah, very good.
Elise, I'm not sure where to put this either, but I wonder about things like hiring practices, both for faith-based organizations and for the local church. How should we be thinking in terms of hiring practices that are equitable to all, but give these concerns some priority? And then not just like actual paid positions, but perhaps even things like, more invitations to preach from folks who are perhaps not from our circles. Maybe there could be, swaps between congregations of people who are willing to volunteer or work, in one church and, trading things. I don't know. I just wonder about ways of being more intentional about, like you say, I think under organizer, building relationships across denominations, across churches, like across, I'm not sure. Do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, I think that would be, certainly talking about the relationship between church volunteers, church members. I think that goes in the organizer category. But when we're thinking about hiring practices and invitations to preach and invitations to lead studies, I think there we're going back to the advocacy, right? Finding those avenues to make changes in the way we do things, right? That, here I framed it, if you're looking at the bullet points there, mostly in terms of like public policy or law, but certainly church policy or even unofficial church policy would fall under that as well. Yeah. Thank you, Angela, for offering that. Okay, so let me move on to the last one here. and give some examples here. So rebel, of course, this is using protest and street activism as vehicles for social justice change. And as we talked about before, using the means that are consistent with the ends. So here, I've just sort of assumed we're talking about non-violent forms of protest, right? As you know, as Christians committed to the way of peace. So protests, vigils, prayer services, pray-ins. Jamar Tisby talked about doing pray-ins even in denominational leadership places, right? So what would it look like for a whole church to show up at denomination headquarters and sit there and pray over racism, right? Again, nonviolent forms of protest, but things that churches do. I would hope we already pray well. So finding ways to make that more public as part of the rebel role, right? Taking those private practices and making them more public. Here, you know, you can have churches making public statements about racism, about being against racism. And Angela, going back to your point about how churches might change the way they do things in terms of hiring practices or invitations, a church could be very public about those intentions so that they're then accountable to not just their own church, but to the public beyond their church walls for that. We've mentioned this before, but preaching and spiritual formation that really challenges people who have power to use their power responsibly, and challenges us to address unjust institutions. You know, this again, spiritual formation is particularly the task of the church. This is what we as churches do. So helping guide us in those ways that we see, again, always judging it by our mission about whether it resonates with the teachings and the way of Christ becomes important here. But that becomes something that churches can do. And then another example of this, a rebel could be, you know, we're talking mostly about groups here, but we're taking it back to the individual level. This could be, you know, the white person who's willing to say the hard things in a racial justice group that people of color feel they can't say or won't be taken seriously if they do. This goes back to some of what we talked about with being an ally. Being willing to have courage and articulate the difficult things, you know, not to provoke people, to shame people, to make them feel small, but rather to begin to stand up for what it is that we believe, right? And be clear about that and not feel that we have to hide that. It is something that goes along with the rebel role. Are there others you can think of that would fit in this rebel role, or even any of these categories, or none of them? Other things that come to mind about collective practices that we might be able to do?
Well, Elise, two things come to my mind right now. One is I had a conversation with Carrie Berkeley at Greater Ebenezer a couple months ago, and we were talking about how our congregations might partner together. And he had mentioned that, you know, he wondered what it might look like if our two congregations partnered together to minister to families who've been disproportionately affected by racism. And so I find that a very intriguing idea. I'm not quite sure what that would look like. I have some ideas, and I'm sure he probably does too, but I thought that was an interesting idea. And then I've also wondered about microloans and grants for, you know, small businesses, Black businesses, churches, from a denominational level and also from just an individual church level.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that idea of churches, Black church, predominantly white church, working together to meet the needs of specific families, I think is so intriguing. Yeah. And we talked earlier about the microloans and everything too. Yeah. Both really great ideas.
I think one of the things I'm concerned with, or that I have to hold myself accountable to, is that it not become paternalistic, as if I know best. I know one of the things that I would really like to do is, and I know the term is partner with, but still I fear I could go into this with a superior attitude or a helpful attitude, almost wanting, much like this Bible study here, to say, teach me, I'm the learner, put me in the one down position because I'm clueless. I wish we could, I would love to do not projects, but learn with, to have, it's not called co-ed, but mixed race Bible studies, spiritual formation, not just worship services, because worship services, you know, we get into different styles and all that, but I think teaching and academics, often we can do in similar manners. And I just think that would be neat to do stuff with, not for. Yeah.
Yeah, because that relationship building, you know, is what keeps us from being paternalistic, right? From thinking we know best and coming in as outsiders, you know, for people who may not even want our help, right? And that's always a risk, right? But with the relationship building, we deal with real people instead of just abstract ideas. So this goes back to a point I said earlier about racial justice communities, that they're committed to accountability. So if we want to become a community that's committed to racial justice, we have to be willing to constantly assess our motivations and our methods, right? Going back to the Thurman quote, right? What are the means we're using? Are they consistent with the ends we're pursuing? And we have to be willing to hear correction and even hear anger. So this book, the Racial Justice Handbook that I've been using, actually talks about how you know you're actually doing the work when people are getting upset, right? How when we're doing the work of racial justice, if everybody is like all kumbaya happy and you know, it really means we're not getting below that surface level of politeness. Now, it doesn't mean we're just savage with each other and ripping each other apart, but it means we can expect for tempers to be raised at some time, for people to not want help, for people to give us correction, right? And for us to not really like the tone that some things are said in, right? All of that means that we're really getting to the point where we're doing the work that needs to be done. So we're not leaning into conflict for conflict's sake, but we're willing to work through that conflict to get to resolution. Does that make sense? So yeah, I think your point, Carrie Lynn, there is so helpful, that we need these relationships with, and that many of the things we're talking about here that are even on this screen, we can do with other congregations that represent other racial groups, and really find ways to partner and learn from them instead of imposing our vision on what needs to be done.
I even think about it with that accountability thing of, you know, I think about what would happen if we played our service for a congregation of diverse culture and heard how they heard what we said, what we read, how we behaved. To ask for constructive feedback in how we do things and things we say. I know that my students are some of my greatest teachers, and they keep me humble in terms of, okay, you said this, but I interpreted it as this. And actually watching yourself on video is incredibly humbling as well. To see yourself as other people see you, and to see ourselves through another race or another culture or another denomination would be incredibly insightful and humbling, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to add any other things that we haven't put here on our notes or on the board, so to speak?
I have a comment. One thing that really strikes me in our conversation as a church is to think about what about Dayspring as a community, and who are we as a church, and what is our unique place, and how can we use what we are to influence change. So I was, looking at, we're a place that calls ourselves sacred and simple, and a place of renewal. And what does it mean to be a church that is a place for renewal for people? How would that fit into racial justice and using kind of what we already do well? And where does that fit in kind of the place? If we're a place of renewal, well, maybe we need to take our message of renewal and take that out in terms of racial. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm sorry.
That does make sense. Yeah. I think going back to the idea of the helper, we have to ask, what are the resources we have, right? So what are we good at? What do we have in terms of skills, in terms of our spiritual vision? What is it that we can share, right? And that would be something that's useful as we partner with others. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Chrissy. Thank you. So on that, I want to give us some time for reflection. I can put this screen back up, but hopefully you wrote down one or two things. I want you to focus on one of the ideas that came up. So it could be something that we just said. Chrissy, you just talked about what it means to be a place of renewal, right? So that might be what you focus on. Give a few minutes, I'll give you a few minutes, I'll play a song here for you to write it out. What does that look like? Like, give it a little more detail. What would whatever idea it was that was intriguing to you, what does that look like? And then also begin to write out what's good about that idea, but what might be some of the drawbacks to it as well, right? So I'm going to give you a few minutes for this writing. You're writing, again, adding more specificity